the great. Welcome everybody to the Security Studies Program Wednesday seminar. I'm Taylor Fravel, the director of the program, and really delighted to welcome you all here today. And I'm especially delighted to welcome our speaker, Sharon Weiner, who's an associate professor at the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. And a special, or for our purposes here at the MIT Security Studies program, she's also a graduate. So it's really wonderful to have you back, Sharon. Her research, teaching, and policy engagement are at the intersection of organizational politics, U.S. national security, with a focus on nuclear weapons strategy and force structure, as well as civil military relations. Her book, Our Own Worst Enemy, Institutional Interests and the Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons Expertise, was published in 2011 and explored the role of organizational and partisan politics and the success and failure of U.S. cooperative non-proliferation programs. It also won the 2012 Lewis Brownlow Award from the U.S. National Academy of Public Administration. More recently, between 2018 and 2020, she was a Carnegie Fellow with a project looking at the relationship between concepts of deterrence and bureaucratic structure, sort of processes and culture. Previously, she served as a program examiner with the National Security Division of the White House's Office of Management and Budget, where she had responsibility for budget and policy issues related to nuclear weapons and non-proliferation. She also has government service with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the U.S. Senate, the House Armed Services Committee, and Los Alamos Laboratory. So it's really a great pleasure to have you here today, Sharon. And let me turn over the virtual floor to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Taylor, and thanks for the invitation and to everyone who's coming today. So I'm looking forward to your feedback on this. This is a little different sort of presentation, and I appreciate Taylor's indulgence on this. So I'm presenting not the results of research, but the design of a research project. So I'm interested in your feedback on whether or not you buy the things that go into it and if you have suggestions for improving it. Before I explain the project, though, let me deal with the acknowledgements. So I'm not alone in this project, which looks at crisis decision-making in a nuclear crisis and uses a virtual reality experience to test ideas about that. I'll explain that a little bit more. But like I said, I'm not alone in this. I have a co-PI, Moritz Kut, who's at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. And I believe he is listening in somewhere out there in the virtual world. I also want to acknowledge my great research assistant, Matthew Hartwell at American University, and acknowledge the people who gave me not an insignificant amount of money for this activity. American University, Princeton University, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Global Zero Foundation, and the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. So it's like a family affair. I also want to acknowledge the company Holosphere in Birmingham in the UK, which did the computer programming for this VR experience. And if any of you are ever interested in VR programming, I'm happy to explain that interaction and how to go about thinking about these things. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to present the research question, why it's interesting, talk a little bit about why VR provides a unique and very useful mechanism for understanding these issues, go over a bit about the actual virtual reality experience itself, and then after you've seen that, it'll put into context a little bit more so I can explain the hypotheses and how they will be tested and the design of both the experiments and the controlled observations that we want to do. So first of all, research questions. There are basically three research questions that are embedded in this experience. The first draws from the notion of deterrence and deterrence theory and the basic underlying presumption of deterrence that assumes decision makers conform in some respect to the expectations of rational decision making, that they can weigh the costs and benefits of their actions, that they can clearly understand the destructive capabilities of nuclear weapons and their relationship to goals of the state, that they understand notions of retaliation and the basics of deterrence and the costs and benefits to the state for that. Of course, the literature on foreign policy decision-making suggests that people engage in all kinds of decision-making pathologies that do not conform to those expectations of rational decision making at all. Not only are we using that to inform this query into decision making in a crisis, we're also looking at the literature that comes from behavioral economics and cognitive psychology to try and hone in on the heuristics, the shortcuts that would most likely be at play in a nuclear crisis. And the VR experience is designed to let us change these scenarios and the repertoire of actions that can take place so that we can hone in on and try and test for specific heuristics, depending on what comes up in the first round of experiments. But the literature on decision-making from all these multiple different disciplines suggests that not only do people not engage in the norms of rationality that are expected by deterrence, but that actually in situations of extreme stress and also in short-term crises, people behave particularly poorly in terms of these rationality assumptions. So one question is, to what extent can we expect the President of the United States or whichever civilian is in control of the nuclear arsenal to adhere to the expectations of rationality and those assumptions that are at the core of deterrence theory, all right? And if instead there are heuristics at play, which heuristics could we predict would be the most predominant? So that's one set of issues. The second set of issues relates to simply a policy debate, actually two policy debates about force structure and strategy in ICBMs. On one hand, there are folks that would argue that ICBMs are vulnerable to incoming nuclear strike. And there's a debate about whether or not the president would launch them early, before situations are clarified, and on warning, and thus in a time frame that would make the president prone to miscalculation and mistakes. Or will they be more likely to ride out any attack and wait until situations unfold and there's more information available about what to do? Related policy debate relates to whether or not the president would be jammed by the military and the crisis working together, such that there's little time to think about what to do, and that the options that are presented and the time frame in which decision making has to take place combine to jam the president to make a decision that is biased towards launch of the ICBMs because of the need to supposedly preserve them from destruction by any incoming strike. So obviously the implications of this research also apply to notions of strategic stability. So if ICBMs are valuable because they can be launched promptly and because they're a sponge for Russian ICBMs, this is an argument that's been used to reinforce strategic stability because presumably it deters the Russians from launching a first strike because of the presumption that they would have to expend about half of their nuclear arsenal to target US ICBMs because of their prompt launch capabilities. So the argument is that the ICBM force structure and strategy encourages strategic stability. The counter argument, of course, is that any president would have 15 minutes or less to determine if an attack is real and if the consequences warrant a nuclear response. Because of their vulnerability, ICBMs are on hair trigger alert, and therefore they are prone to early use, and thus they hurt strategic stability. So these are the questions that we are hoping to weigh in on. A couple of other things that this research has implications for. One is the literature about misperceptions and unintended use of force in war. And the second is the history of false alarms and whether or not decision makers would be prone to launch nuclear weapons when in fact, what they're seeing is not an incoming first strike, but actually a false alarm. And there's a history of false alarms in the nuclear era in the US, which I can go into if anyone's interested in. So nuclear decision-making in the United States using a virtual reality experience that is designed to mimic what would actually happen in a real nuclear crisis in the US. So before I explain the experience, let me address the issue about why virtual reality. What does this give me other than an excuse to play a lot of VR games while pretending that I'm actually doing research. Okay, so one, there's about 40 years of experience in psychology that shows when you are in an immersive VR environment that is properly designed, your brain actually believes you are present in a different situation. So what this means is that we can add a whole different level of reality to making people feel like not they're gaming a nuclear crisis, but they are actually in one. And so just briefly, two concepts to this in the virtual reality world. One is called immersion. Immersion is a consequence of the technology. And so we use a fully immersive virtual reality headset. For many folks, when they think of virtual reality, some of you may think of the little cardboard thing that the New York Times set out that you can put your cell phone in and view virtual reality things. This is kind of the other extreme. So we use a Vive Pro wireless headset. It's 360 degrees. You can literally look everywhere around you. It blocks out all other light. You see only what is in the computer program, and the computer program basically places you in it and responds to you. So the literature on virtual reality and the psych experiments that have been done with it suggest that this is the equipment that maximizes your brain's immersion in the computer program. The second thing that has to do with VR is called presence. And this is a psychological state of actually being there, of being present in the story and the storyline that is happening within the virtual reality program. And research shows that presence is a function of visuals. And so you'll see when I show you part of the experience that we have visually tried to duplicate the Oval Office and other things. But research shows that more important than visual duplication is sound and touch. So throughout this entire VR experience, there are a huge number, huge number of sounds that are laid into the experience. So if you were one of the participants in this, sitting in the headset in the Oval Office, you would hear the faint tick of the grandfather clock. You would hear the footsteps of people outside walking around. If you were paying attention, you would even hear the HVAC system cycling on and off in the background. And these sounds change as you go through the different environments. The other key thing, though, is touch. So research shows that if you can touch something in the virtual world and it's actually also there in the exact same place in the real world, this increases your presence in the virtual experience. And so in our virtual experience, there are two things that you can actually touch and move and manipulate, and they behave the same in the real and the virtual worlds. And that's a chair that you sit on and a table. And so the ability of you to get up and move this chair and see it move and also touch it really increases your presence in this. I can also talk about a couple other things in the Q&A if it's interesting. One thing to keep in mind, though, as you see this, there's a problem called the uncanny valley in VR, where if things start to too closely approximate the real visual world, especially human forms, people get totally creeped out and decide that it's a computer experience and it's not anything they want to be present in. So you do have to be careful when you're designing these things that you can approach visual reality, but you don't want to do it completely. And you'll see the avatar that we use. In this experience, we have a computer-generated avatar, which is the military aide with the nuclear football. One problem we do have in this experience, which we've noted in doing demonstrations, is you can't see your hands, right? If anybody's played any VR games, often you have controllers that you can manipulate and you can see a representation of those. In our experience, you actually can't see your hands. It's sometimes something people notice. It tends to fade away. And if someone wants to give me tens of thousands of dollars, maybe even more, we could figure out how to program that in, but it's basically very expensive because its hands move and it's hard for the computer to track them. All right, so that's VR and the things that you want to manipulate in VR to have your brain think you're in a real experience. But why is this better than war games? All right, so there's a small literature on war games. But here are 4 reasons why this VR experience will give a better representation of crisis decision making. Okay, number 1, traditional war games usually have problems accurately capturing human stress. This is especially in conditions of short-term crises. So I'm not saying that traditional war games don't capture stress. I'm saying the literature shows that a VR experience will be better at doing that and more realistic of what a nuclear crisis would actually be. Number 2, traditional war games have credibility gaps because people are standing in for other people. In our experience, each participant plays the role of the president, so they don't have to do any translation about who they're standing in for or who they think or what they think that person might have to do. Number 3, traditional war games usually come with a whole set of rules that limit innovation and creativity. Our experience allows people to ask literally any question and engage in almost any behavior, including in one instance, someone who tried to get up and leave the room, but of course it was a virtual room and we didn't get to them quickly enough and they ran into the real wall. So that was exciting. So in our game, like I said, you can literally ask any question you want, so there's more room for innovation. And the 4th reason why this is better than a traditional war game is what's called the Hawthorne Effect. In many war games, participants act differently because they know they're being observed. So certainly we're observing people while they're in the VR headset, but because of the design of, and the abilities of VR, they are present in that experience, and the notion that we are observing them completely disappears. So much so that we actually have a problem in this VR experience. So far we've only done demos because when it came time to actually do the experiment, there was this little thing called COVID-19. And the last thing you want to do is be up close and personal with your head in a headset that a bunch of other people have used before you. So we've only been able to do demos, but what we discovered when people took part in this experience, we actually have a problem getting them to recognize that the experience is over, right? So the experience lasts 15 minutes. People walk, they move around, they ask questions. At the end, all the things that you're interacting with disappear. And we found that people didn't realize that it was over, time to take off the headset. And so I would walk up to them and tap them on the shoulder, and they would jump because they didn't realize it was time to get out of the experience. We tried flashing in the experience. This was a game, it's now over. Even so, that still didn't work. So this is evidence that we have a fair amount of immersion and that the people are not aware that they are being watched. All right. So let me talk about the experience itself just briefly, and then show you a couple of snippets about it. And then I'll talk about how we're going to use it as the basis for this experiments and controlled observation. So in the VR experience, the participant plays the role of the United States. The script and all the interaction is based upon the literature we have about command and control of nuclear weapons and nuclear crises. It is also based on 13 interviews that I conducted with military and civilians who either inform this process, have taken part in war games, or have taken part in training of others if a nuclear crisis ever took place in the real world. So this is as close as we can get in the unclassified world to actually understanding what would most likely be the case in a scenario involving incoming nuclear weapons. Participants begin in a, quote, neutral room. So it's a desk in a room with blah walls that has the seal of the President of the United States. And we use this room to establish a transition from the real world to the virtual one, to go through a bunch of safety protocols and to help the person in the experience understand you can talk, you can move, you can ask questions, and importantly for the IRB's perspective, what you do to get out of the experience if you are totally freaked out. And so the participant enters the Oval Office, and at this point there's a strict sequence of events. People going into this experience know that it is a national security crisis. They don't know any of the details. This is also why for this larger forum, I'm suppressing the entire video of the entire experience, because we don't want, people would be excluded from participating if they knew many of the details. But so you're playing the role of president, you're sitting at the Resolute desk, there's a TV playing a news story. It is a story about some crisis with Russia. Details are really ambiguous. This is one of the variables that in future iterations of this experience we can change. And one of the things we'll use to experiment with is changing the number of people who see a snippet about a crisis with Russia versus a snippet about a festival on the mall in Washington, D.C. Okay, so we can test for some things with that. After 40 seconds, an alarm goes off, military aid with a football comes in, and the president is told this is a crisis and they have to evacuate, right? Let me try and share my screen now and see if I can get this to actually show you, all right? Bear with me just a second.
Thanks for that update, Richard. As you just heard in the previous segment, the situation in Europe does not appear to be improving. We will continue to closely follow developments and the stand-up of the enemy that has been unfolding for the last few days. We're here now live.
Mr. President, the National Security Advisor is held up in traffic. Can we push your meeting on the Pan-Asian trade negotiations from 4 o'clock to 4:30 p.m. today?
Yes. Troop movements seem to have increased concerns about the algorithm.
So that gives you an idea of the Oval Office, the visuals. Here's the mill aid coming in. People are in this situation for about 40 seconds, and there are strict protocols about when the person who's manipulating the computer has to call the alarm and everything else. I should also have mentioned that the interface of this game is such that you're a participant, you're in a headset, you're in the virtual world, which is being run off a server computer. And then there's the game master, which is either myself or my colleague Moritz. And we control a tablet, and we use this tablet to call up responses to what the participant says. And there are about 250 pre-programmed responses that we can call up. So we are listening to the participant on a headset, and you heard the voice there of my kind husband who agreed to participate in the filming of this. And so you can't hear us, but we can hear you, and we respond to you according to a set of protocols about what answer is appropriate to the question that you ask. So you're told here to evacuate. If you don't leave, there are some other prompts that tell you to evacuate. But so at this point, the mill aid comes in, the president is evacuated. The president then goes downstairs through an elevator to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center at the basement of the East Wing of the White House. And there they get a brief about the nuclear crisis. A couple points about this briefing. Well, actually, let me hold off on that for just a minute. So the president gets a brief about the crisis, and then they get to ask questions of advisors for up to about 13 minutes. So the entire VR experience is 15 minutes. By the time you get down to the POC, the Emergency Operations Center, there's about 13 minutes left, give or take some, depending on how quickly people move up and down in the elevator. You'll see when you see the next snippet, there's a clock on the table. And this clock is very important in the experience because it is counting backwards the time to a last chance for a decision. And so the last chance for a decision is the time it would take incoming ICBMs from Russia to reach US missile fields, which is an estimated 27 to 30 minutes, minus the time it would take a launch order and for the US ICBMs to fly from their silos far enough away to not be destroyed by incoming weapons, minus the time that it would take NORAD and Strategic Command to agree that they understand that there are incoming nuclear weapons and to notify the president. And so that means in all practicality, the maximum that a person would have would be about 13 minutes, likely a little less. You'll also see when we get down to this Emergency Operations Center that there are multiple different video screens. And so these video screens would bring in advisors through secure video connections. You'll see 6 screens. For the iteration that we're doing for the current experiment, there are only 2 advisors that come in on these video screens, but we have the ability to program in 6 different advisors for multiple different reasons. The 2 advisors was a compromise. One, the more advisors we have, the more complicated the computer programming gets. But also in my interviews, given the crisis that we are mimicking, which is pretty much a bolt from the blue, the chances are these would realistically be the only advisors that would be readily available. And so you'll see the head of strategic command is on one video screen. The national security advisor will eventually come in on another video screen. There's also a phone connection, which brings in NORAD and also the deputy duty officer in the National Military Command Center in the basement of the Pentagon. Again, lots of other people, and the person at the table can ask for anybody they want. And of course, their advisors will promise to try to get them. And of course, they will never arrive in time before the clock reaches 0. So with that, let me just show the brief snippet here about the experience in the PIAC.
Please come in. There's a chair for you here at the table. Mr. President, this is General Doyle of the Pentagon's Command Center. We need to convene a nuclear crisis conference as soon as possible. You'll see Strat on Secure VTC Channel 1. And we are expecting National Security Advisor Hacker to join soon. NORAD is also listening in. We've called your advisors, and they'll join the conference as soon as they're located and move to a secure facility.
Yes, Mr. President, this is Strategic Command. You don't have much time to make a decision. It's important that you focus on that clock to your right. It's counting down the time to the last chance for a decision. If you don't make a decision before that clock hits 0, we'll lose our entire ICBM force. I strongly recommend you begin the conference now.
We've got the National Security Advisor coming up on VTC Channel 2.
Hello? I can't see anyone. Oh, Mr. President. There you are. I'm sorry I'm late.
The Mill-Aid will now present.
Hold up on the Mill-Aid there for a minute. So the participant is briefed about the national security crisis. In my research, I'm told that the goal is to keep this briefing to 1 minute or less, ideally closer to 30 seconds. And if the participant doesn't interrupt, indeed, that's what we do as part of the script. The briefing covers the size of the attack, the likely targets, and the resulting consequences in terms of casualties, but also in terms of the weapons that are left in the nuclear arsenal after this strike, if it's real. This scenario is based upon 299 incoming ICBMs. There's high confidence that they're from Russia. They're headed towards US ICBM fields. The estimate is the incoming attack will destroy the entire US ICBM force, plus associated Air Force bases. Casualty estimates are in the range of 2 million, with some cities destroyed and significant fallout damage. And the casualty estimates were actually done for us by Matthew McKinsey at NRDC and Hans Christensen at the Federation of American Scientists. So the Mill-Aid presents the options that are recommended. And then, and this point is crucial, the head of strategic command immediately says, wait a minute, you don't have to look at those options. Tell me what you want to do, and we will modify them at your request. And this is a crucial part of the experience because the participant is told many times throughout the process, we will put together anything you want, help us do this. But in the demos we've run, what we've discovered is almost nobody pays any attention to this. So let me just show you just briefly the options.
The options that we recommend, each option spells out the targets and the capabilities used versus
Mr. President,
those
I
retained.
need to know your guidance.
You'll also
I
see
can
another-
modify. Sir, please focus on the task at hand. We have incoming nuclear weapons. I need your guidance about how to respond. We can modify these options at your request, but I need your guidance about what you want to do.
So you'll begin to see there the options. And so there is a limited counterforce strike, a full-scale counterforce strike, and then the third is a full-scale counterforce strike that adds in the leadership. In each of these options, all of the ICBMs are used, and this is also a condition that we will vary in the experiment. So for the rest of the experience, like I said, the participant can ask questions of advisors. They can ask for new advisors. They will hear various prompts according to a time script that involve the military command center trying to get an executable order, the head of strategic command trying to get guidance from the president about what to do, and the head of the Secret Service trying desperately and very enthusiastically to get the president to evacuate the White House. All right. So let me just briefly jump forward to the experimental design of this, because I realize I'm running out of time. So 3 hypotheses, 2 experiments, 1 controlled observation. Hypothesis 1, which I call the jamming hypothesis. Is the president more or less likely to be pressured to launch all or most ICBMs to preserve them? Or will they wait until after detonation? So the independent variable for the jamming hypothesis is time. And so the experiment we're going to do has 2 groups. In one group, they experience the full script, as you just saw snippets of. And in this script, there's the clock, it's ticking down. There are multiple references to time. In the control group, they get the same script, but we eliminate the clock and all references to time. The same time still plays out, but it's just that the periodic references to it disappear. Everything else is identical. And so the difference between the results of the 2 groups should help us say something about whether the pressure of time matters. The second hypothesis is, I call it the use them or lose them hypothesis. Is the president likely to be pressured by the military to use all of the ICBMs to avoid their destruction? So here the independent variable is the military options that are given. In the regular script, all of those options include the use of the ICBMs. You can ask for other options, but the initial options you're presented all use all of the ICBMs. The control group in this instance would get an option that does not use all of the ICBMs. And so hopefully that would give us an opportunity to say something about that. The third hypothesis is about rationality versus the use of heuristics. And here we will have 2 independent coders code the discussion that's part of the gameplay, which is going to be recorded. And we will have, and there's also a post-experience questionnaire where we ask the person about some of the reasoning that went into their actions. And they will code it according to a predetermined list of what counts as more or less rational and what counts as an example of a heuristic, right? So these 2 sets of experiments, one about jamming, one about use them or lose them, both coded for rationality or heuristics, will be done on unsuspecting college students at some university, likely Princeton University, because that's where my VR equipment is, and they've provided a laboratory for this. We will use approximately 50 students for each test for a total of 200. And we will then use descriptive statistics to explain likely responses from this group of people. Obviously, sample size is an issue here. We also need to control for external events because we want to do this experiment at approximately the same period of time. It also takes a fairly long amount of time to run people through this experience, given all the protocols that you have to follow. So how then do we help with generalizability to actually real decision makers? So here's where the controlled observation comes in. So we will use the original experience as a controlled observation with people who are, quote, national security professionals. And so this will be defined as people with membership in one of the think tanks in Washington, D.C., like Brookings or CSIS or the Council on Foreign Relations. And we don't yet have permission to do that, but I've reached out to a couple of these places, and I think that that will entirely be possible. So if we get the same results in the controlled observation with the 50 national security professionals as we do in the experiments with the college students, that increases our generalizability to say that our results actually would likely be true of someone who played the role of the president. So let me just stop there briefly. I would say we will have additional iterations of this experience going forward. The entire computer program is designed such that my colleague Moritz and I can change the script, the scenarios, the advisors and things without spending a whole lot of money. And so with that, I will open it up for your questions, and I'm going to put in the chat box the website where you can find out more information about the experience.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon. I now really regret that we weren't able to host you in March, and at least some of us would have had the opportunity to experience this, although I don't know if we would have had subjects or controls or some other kind of guinea pig. So the floor is open. Let's see. First question to Benjamin Harris. Ben, if you want to turn your video on and ask your question.
Sure. Thank you so much for the presentation. I found this fascinating and like a really interesting direction for research to go. I'll leave other people to ask questions about the content of the research. I'm actually really interested in the morality of this, because it does seem as if like it's an extremely immersive situation. You have people who are surprised when the game is over, and you're putting people in an immersive situation where they're taking personal responsibility over tens of millions of people dying. And I think, like, you know, in survey experiments, it's pretty easy to say like, hey, everyone knows this is an experiment. But I've used virtual reality once, and it was so mind altering. Like, I did forget where I was. And I am curious if, like, how your team has gone about debating this issue, and what do you think the pros and cons, and if you've taken any measures to try and increase the ethics of this.
Sure, thanks. No, this is a great question. So obviously there is IRB approval for doing this at not just my own institution, but at Princeton, where the experiment will actually take place. So part of the trade-off is benefit versus risk. And so one of the arguments is that if we can improve the decision-making protocols or change nuclear strategies such that it eliminates or reduces the danger of accidental, unintentional, or misguided use of nuclear weapons, that would obviously be a benefit to lots of different people. There are also protocols in the experience where people can opt out if they start to freak out, and we go over that specifically. There is also an anxiety scale that involves a pre-test and a post-test. And if you show at the end of the experience that your anxiety is at a certain level, there are a list of protocols that go in with that. Trying to think what else. There are certain people who are excluded from taking part in this. So for example, anyone who has experienced or has PTSD is prohibited. They're not part of the pool. A couple other things, there are also some physical things that go with the VR equipment. So for example, we used a wireless headset. And for people with a pacemaker, no, sorry, you can't participate. But that has to do with the VR technology. So this has been vetted by multiple different IRBs, very conscious of these problems. But yes, we are intentionally stressing out a bunch of people, and there are consequences to that. In the most extreme circumstance, I also have some virtual reality programs that are used in hospitals and psychology departments that are specifically designed for anxiety and stress reduction. So if you max out on the anxiety score, I've got a program for you. There are also partially protocols and signs in place to explain to people that this was a game. It wasn't real, nobody died, and you don't suffer the consequences for the choice you made. What I will say, though, is doing demos, there was an additional ethical consideration that I hadn't anticipated. And so I'm playing the role of the game master, queuing up responses to someone, and I'm actually bullying them. Because, and I'm willing to argue, and I can justify that this experience and what I'm doing is based on what would happen in reality. But it is absolutely clear that if you do all the protocols in a certain time, you are bullying people. And it puts the game master, the people on the other side, in a very uncomfortable position. And that's something that I hadn't anticipated.
Great, thanks. So we have a couple questions on a similar theme from the live stream on YouTube that I wanted to bring in, and they basically boil down to whether or not it makes sense to use college students. or in fact, the experiment should use adults or adults with more life experience than college students?
So no, this is a good question. And the answer ultimately is maybe it does. You know, when doing an experiment like this, you have to make compromises. And a lot of experiments that are then generalized to adult populations are actually done on college students because they are available. That's part of the reason why we have the controlled observation, is to see if there are problems with generalizability, if there's completely different behavior, in which case then we would have to use other people. But in my experience doing the demos, and again, this is anecdotal because these were only demonstrations, and some of the demonstrations were explicitly intended for a political purpose. But in my experience of doing demos across people with a wide range of experiences, I do not see significant differences, either in terms of the emotional connection to the experience or the actual results. So at this point, I think college students are a good stand-in and are helpful for doing this. The one problem with college students, and this is, there's no problem with college students. As a professor, I love them all, right? One of the things we do, though, is if you have significant gaming or VR experience, you're disqualified from participation, because there is a suggestion that the more experience you have in the virtual world, the more likely you are to see this as a game. Now, it's not clear that that's true for this experience because there's a lot of immersion in it, and I've had people with significant experience in VR do it and get freaked out by the options they were given and what they had to do, but those people are disqualified anyway.
Okay, great. Next question is to Rachel Teacott. Rachel, if you'd like to turn on your camera and ask your question.
Sure. Hi, thank you so much for this talk. It was fascinating, and I'm sitting here kind of drooling over the ways I would love to incorporate VR into future work. So, like, to that end, could you talk a little bit about the logistics of bringing this kind of work into your research? So how much does it cost? How big a team do you need? What's the process for this kind of research design? Thanks so much.
So thank you. So number one, you've got to be just crazy about time. Right? This was just a dumb thing, right? It started off as a crazy idea when I saw a VR thing, and all the stars aligned. We got money to do it, and we had an opportunity. Space became available, et cetera. So my team, there are basically two of us. We happened to find a great computer programming company in the UK, Hawthorne, who understood what we were trying to do and felt that it was worth their time to do it. So the computer programming so far has cost in the neighborhood of $120,000, but I'm pretty sure that there was a lot of comp time on top of that. The biggest problem, I would say, is as a political scientist, trying to understand the VR technology. Now, my colleague Moritz is actually an engineer, and he will remind me periodically when I'm swearing at the computer equipment that no, it's not intended to work right the first time. But I'm not used to, you know, that sort of experimentation and putting things aside. So I'd say the largest learning curve for me was getting comfortable with the equipment and getting comfortable with the notion that it's just going to fail and having backups for that. But the other thing that I found really useful, which was like speaking another language, was trying to translate my scholarship into a storyline, which specifically evoked certain emotions and responses without biasing them. And so that involved a bunch of trips to the psychology literature and trying to understand that. But I would maintain that VR has huge potential for trying to understand some of the issues which, you know, we tend to wave our hands at and look at, but we can't actually get people to experience because there are, you know, not very many examples of them, or it's unethical to put people in that situation. But it does provide a tremendous opportunity to put people in a situation they would not otherwise experience in a controlled fashion, and try and understand what they're doing. But the financial buy-in costs are huge. The other buy-in cost, which is why this is an experiment for me at AU being conducted at Princeton, is the space. So if any of you do VR or have Oculus, you put it on in your living room, you wander around, you kill a few space pirates, you do whatever you're gonna do, play Beat Saber. You know, you're walking around in like a 5x5 box. Our space is, I think we need something like 18 feet by 6 feet. It's huge. It's a huge space. And so there are just physical requirements. And so the lab I have at Princeton, all the equipment is set up. People can walk around. There's no big issue. And if I had to take that up and set it down again, that would be a real detriment to getting this moving.
Great, thanks. Next question goes to Eric Higginbotham.
Thanks, Sharon. This is fascinating. I got lots of questions, but I'll just pick a couple here. My first question is really about what other scenarios this might be applicable to and the sort of practical limitations concerning where the technology is today. So in this scenario, we had one decision maker, one or two advisors, a 12-minute deadline. So in a way, you've really picked the great case for VR where it is today, maybe. You've got finite choices, et cetera, et cetera. But what other cases do you think this applies to? To what extent can you introduce more actual players into the game? And then finally, you did it VR. Presumably you could have, it would have been a little bit different, but you could have done it non-VR. You could have had a room, you couldn't have had maybe the makeup for the Oval Office, but you could have had the bunker room pretty well designed and decorated with either tapes or, the recording or the mics or a live person with a script. So how different do you think that would have been? And then finally, if you'll let me ask one more question, if you ran this through for an actual real president, what's your hypothesis about what the effect would be on his decision-making if this actually happened? Would this make him more likely to do something, to launch? I mean, that would be my guess, but I'm curious what your view is.
So many questions. So first of all, I'm going to give the self-serving response, which is I put my email address in the chat box. And if anybody has additional questions or feedback, please do send it to me. So the difference between the real emergency bunker and the virtual one is the virtual one immerses your brain in the situation more than actually being in a space that looks like it. And partially, I will admit, this is a cheap technology trick where I prey upon the fact that most people have never done VR. But this is the way the brain works. So you actually will feel you were more in a crisis in my VR experience than if you were actually playing it out in a physical location. So the ability to use this for other experiences is constrained by the technology in the sense that you can have inputs and outputs, but to date, we don't have an autonomous virtual reality computer system that can interpret your actions and respond to them by listening to them and reasoning through them. So there is no combination of AI and VR, although I'm told it's coming within the next 5 years or so. So we were limited to scenarios where a human, me, or my colleague Moritz, can provide a repertoire of responses, and to a scenario where those responses would be consistent across game masters and responses. So in other words, any participant who asks a certain question will be assured of getting the same response. And that limits the ability to use the technology. But otherwise, I would say that VR is primed for trying to understand ambiguous visual situations and translating them into decision-making in a variety of different ways. But you have to carve off a piece of it. You can't do the whole thing simply because you can't have that many actors. You're also constrained. So when you're in a VR headset, part of the immersion is no matter where you look, the computer program renders you that place in the room where you would be. And this is really hard for the computer. And so the more things you have going on, the harder it is for the computer to render that experience in a way that your eyes don't see it. So many people, when you first start to use VR, you get motion sickness. And this is because your brain is picking up on the fact that even though your eyes don't notice it, the world is not rendering at the speed that it should. And so the more things you ask of the computer program, the more likely it is you'll get those visual spaces and problems. This is, for example, why we don't use haptic gloves to monitor your hand movements. It's just too computationally intensive for the computer to keep up. So that is also an issue that comes into play. But again, you can resolve these issues also partially by creating a storyline that seeks to test the thing you want to test without necessarily creating the entire world, if that makes sense. And a real president depends on who that president is. No, actually, I would argue it doesn't depend on who that president is. I will say we've done demos with people who should be very familiar with this experience, and they freak out. Lots of people freak out. It's very exciting.
Great, thanks. Next, Phil Hahn. Phil, if you want to turn on your video and ask your question.
Sure, Sharon, up at Naval War College. Glad to have this today. Wish my students were in. I'm getting ready to do Brody strategy in the missile age, and I had them watch Failsafe this week. But my question is a follow-up on Eric's, which is, you talked about the rationality of deterrence, and yet we rely upon the credibility of a somewhat irrational second response. So in the sense that once the first attack has occurred, have you looked at scenarios that would allow that first strike to occur and see then if the individual would go ahead and do the second strike? Is that feasible within your scenarios?
We could do a scenario like that, and it's a good idea, maybe as a second iteration. I mean, we're about to do once we can get back and actually do experiments, the first round of these things. What I will say is people are told, because we're taking in people who don't necessarily, and as participants, people who don't necessarily know nuclear things and force structure, they are informed about the secure second strike, both as jargon and in ways to help them understand that it is there. And one of the things that we're looking for in our assessment of rationality is the acknowledgement that if you let the ICBMs be destroyed, you still have an ability to retaliate. But yeah, I can imagine additional scenarios where you're forced to write out and then decide about whether or not you're using that. What I would personally like to do is scenarios that involve submarines and other things. But in reality, a nuclear crisis involving a submarine, the president would almost certainly be evacuated immediately. And that means a helicopter. And that's probably a $500,000 VR programming issue to mimic helicopter, right? And I mean, somebody give me the money, I'd happily do it, but that's an expensive thing.
Great, thanks. So this will be our last question before turning off the live stream. Aidan Millif, over to you. If you can turn on your video and ask your question.
Thanks. Yeah, this was a really fascinating talk. I enjoyed a lot seeing someone bring the potential of VR into an actual plan to measure stuff and recruit subjects and all that. That's really fascinating. I wanted to ask, you talk a lot about creating an emotional experience, which I think is, I agree, is a really important part of getting a realistic scenario to get realistic measurements. I wanted to ask a little bit about what you might do to measure the emotional experience you create. And beyond the screeners, like the anxiety and the PTSD screeners that you use, how you're capturing that data and what you're planning to do with it.
So this is a great question. And the answer right now is we're probably not going to capture that data, at least initially. But there are a couple ways to do it. One is to measure the degree to which people sweat. And yes, there are ways to measure that. Another is temperature. The one that I think is that I would really like to do, but as I think is beyond our capability right now, is there's some VR equipment that can measure where you're looking at any particular time. And the relationship between what you look at and the decisions you make often suggests something about your connection to the thing that you looked at or that you heard. And that's entirely possible within the equipment that we have right now. We just hadn't planned on doing it because this first set of experiences, we're trying to look at basic broad questions. And to be honest, my bet is that when we do this experience and the controlled observations in the experiment, that we are going to get a consistency of results along one or two lines. And if that's right, then we can start to hone in on some of these things. But until I can prove that, I'm basically going off of much more of a hunch that I'm capable of investing in, you know, arguments and a lot of time and a lot of other things. So we want to stop, prove the basic proof of concept, prove the basic ideas that we think are at play, and then move on from there.
Wonderful. So this concludes the live stream portion of the presentation. And now we'll move on to sort of the internal sort of breakout rooms here at MIT. So